The courtroom was suffocatingly silent, the weight of the trial pressing down on every soul present. The defendant, a man in his 30s, sat in the center, his orange convict jumpsuit a sharp contrast to the polished wood of the courtroom. He wasn't the typical picture of guilt. His face was calm, almost too calm, as if he had accepted his fate long before this day. His eyes were steely, scanning the room, seemingly untouched by the gravity of the proceedings. Judge Hargrave, a man known for his unshakable composure, was reading through the case notes, his gavel resting heavily on the desk. The trial had dragged on for weeks, and the jury was nearing a decision. Everyone had assumed the conclusion was inevitable. Then, in a moment that no one could have predicted, a small voice broke the silence. The man didn't do it. Everyone froze. All eyes turned to Emma, the 8-year-old girl standing alone at the front of the courtroom. Her finger was pointed directly at the convict, Michael Carter, sitting in the orange jumpsuit. The room seemed to hold its breath. Emma wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. The trial was about a financial fraud scheme that had ruined families, caused untold suffering. Michael had been accused of being the mastermind behind it all. But the little girl's words were a bombshell. She wasn't shaking, wasn't frightened. She simply stood there, unblinking, her small voice steady. He didn't do it, she repeated. I can prove it. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Lawyers shot frantic glances at each other, unsure of how to handle this. The judge's brow furrowed, and his voice rang out, commanding silence. Who do you think did it, child? Just Hargrave asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. Emma's gaze never wavered from the convict. For a moment the room waited. What could she possibly know that they didn't? The investigation had been thorough, evidence had been presented, witnesses had testified, and yet Emma stood there calm as a summer day, her statement clear. What did she mean? How could a child with no experience in criminal law make such a claim? Emma had been living in the shadow of this trial for months. She wasn't just an ordinary child in this courtroom. Her mother had been one of the victims of the fraud scheme Michael Carter was accused of orchestrating. Her family's life had been turned upside down when their savings disappeared, their dreams shattered. Emma's mother, once an accomplished architect, had been left devastated and struggling to rebuild her life. But there was more. Emma knew things she hadn't shared with anyone. The whispers, the hints in her memories that had never fully made sense until now. She didn't know how she knew, but she was certain of one thing: Michael Carter was not the mastermind. She had seen him once in the park weeks before everything went public. It wasn't just a chance encounter. There had been something in his eyes, something that didn't match the accusations. But there was one person who did. The truth, as Emma was starting to understand, it was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Emma wasn't supposed to stand up in court and accuse someone she had been scared, terrified to speak up about the things she had seen, the things she remembered. But standing there with Michael Carter's guilty face staring back at her, she couldn't remain silent anymore. I know what happened, she said, her voice stronger now. The person who Took our money, it wasn't him the judge. Motioned for the lawyers to pause. Proceed, young lady, he said, his voice calm but firm, there was no mistaking it. Now he was giving her the floor. Emma took a deep breath, knowing this would change everything. The real person behind it, the one who took everything. She hesitated, looking back at her mother's empty seat in the courtroom, where she should have been sitting, supporting her. It was my uncle, he was the one who convinced Michael to do it. A sharp gasp echoed around the room. Emma's uncle, the quiet man who had always been a part of the background, an unremarkable figure. The entire room shifted, and their focus now fell on Emma's uncle, who was seated at the back of the courtroom. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. The courtroom was a whirlwind now. Lawyers were shouting, the prosecutor and defense were pointing fingers, demanding clarity, trying to make sense of what Emma had just said. But the little girl didn't look away from her uncle, who had now stood up and started to speak in a voice too loud for comfort. Emma, no, you don't understand, he stammered, his face pale. I had no choice. I thought it was the only way to save the family. But Emma didn't stop. She had spent the last few weeks piecing things together in her mind, the conversations she had overheard, the odd behavior of her uncle, his strange urgency the day their money disappeared. It all made sense. Now I heard you on the phone, Uncle Peter, she said, her voice steady but filled with accusation. You talked to him, you told him to cover up the fraud, to make sure everyone thought it was Michael, and then you made Mom think it was her fault. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Emma's Uncle Peter looked like he was about to collapse. His eyes darted nervously around, avoiding everyone's gaze. But the truth had been spoken. Peter's shoulders slumped, and the tension in the room reached a breaking point. His eyes filled with tears, and for a brief moment he seemed like a broken man, his facade of control shattered. I didn't want to do it, Peter whispered, his voice cracked. I thought it was the only way to protect you, but it went too far. I never meant for it to hurt Mom or you, Emma. I thought if we made Michael the scapegoat, no one would suspect the family. The confession hit like a bombshell. The court was paralyzed, unsure of how to respond. The accused man, Michael Carter, looked stunned, his eyes wide with disbelief. It wasn't him, and Emma's uncle had just confessed to using his own family to cover up his mistakes. Peter's words had ripped apart everything everyone thought they knew, the case that had seemed so clear, the fraud, the missing funds, the accusations against Michael Carter had all been built on lies. Peter's confession had opened up a chasm, one that no one was sure how to cross. But the greatest shock was yet to come. Peter's confession wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the unraveling. If his family had been hiding this truth, what else had they kept from Emma? What other secrets had been buried in the dark recesses of her past? Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The world felt like it was spinning too fast. She was faced with a choice now. Could she forgive him? Could she let him face the consequences, even though he was family? She felt the weight of the courtroom pressing in on her, every eye on her, as she processed what this all meant for her future. The judge banged his gavel, calling order to the courtroom, and it was clear that the case was far from over, but Emma's role was no longer just that of a witness. She had helped uncover a truth that no one could ignore. With the truth now laid bare, Peter was arrested and Michael's charges were dropped. The court was adjourned, but there was still a long road ahead for Emma and her family. But as the courtroom began to clear, Emma remained still. She was surrounded by chaos, yet within her there was an unexpected peace. For the first time in a long while she felt free from the shadows that had loomed over her life. As Emma and her mother walked out of the courtroom together, the sky outside was soft with the fading light of the day. Emma held her mother's hand tightly, the bond between them stronger than ever. Her mother had always been her anchor, but today it was Emma who had anchored them both. She had spoken the truth when it mattered most, and in doing so she had reclaimed not just her family's future, but her own. "Are you okay?" her mother asked softly. Emma nodded. For the first time she felt a sense of calm that had eluded her for so long. "I think I am," Emma said, looking up at the sky, knowing that the truth had set her free. "What do you think? Could an 8-year-old really uncover the truth in a case like this, or is there more to Emma's story than we realize?" Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the justice system should have been more receptive to her testimony from the start? We'd love to hear your opinions and reactions to this shocking courtroom twist. Let's keep the conversation going.